I'm an avid hiker, and during a solo road trip across the country, I decided to explore some trails in Colorado. I was on this journey to clear my head after a tough breakup. My ex-fiancée, someone I once thought was my soulmate, had betrayed me with one of my best friends. A double betrayal that left me reeling. At 31, I figured this trip would help me start fresh. Colorado was one of the states I was most eager to visit, with its sprawling forests and incredible views. I chose the Elk Ridge National Forest for its reputation as a hiker's paradise. One of the main draws for me was the solitude, miles of quiet trails without the noise of crowded paths. I found a remote area on the map and drove down a narrow, bumpy road until I couldn't go any further. After parking, I geared up and checked my phone. No signal. Perfect. I memorized my starting point, locked up the car, and set off into the wilderness. I knew that hiking alone in an unfamiliar forest wasn't the safest decision, but caution has never been my companion. The lure of solitude and untamed paths was far more enticing than sticking to the beaten track. Before setting out, I had meticulously downloaded the area map and tested my GPS, ensuring it worked offline. No, I didn't get lost. This isn't one of those stories. What happened instead defies logic, leaving me to grapple with fragments of a memory that feels more like a waking nightmare. My destination was a summit overlook known for its breathtaking views, roughly 4 miles from the trailhead. The path was rugged and tangled with roots that snaked like silent guardians across the ground, slowing my progress to a cautious 1.5 miles per hour. I relished the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the gravel and the forest's whispers as the canopy swayed overhead. The woods were dense, yet the air hummed with an uneasy silence, as though the forest itself held its breath, waiting for something or someone. An hour into my ascent, the weather shifted. The overcast sky cracked open, releasing a gentle drizzle that quickly soaked through my jacket. I've always hated hiking in the rain. It turns a serene adventure into a soggy trudge. After some internal debate, I decided to head back. The thought of squelching the remaining miles in drenched socks was enough to quell my stubborn resolve. As I retraced my steps, the rain intensified, and the once inviting forest transformed into something else entirely. The trees, now shadowy silhouettes against the dim light, seemed to loom closer. Each gust of wind carried the sharp tang of damp earth and decay. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd parked, the rain had dulled to a mist, but the scene waiting for me was anything but dull. At first, I didn't notice anything amiss. My car, parked precisely as I'd left it, seemed ordinary from a distance, but as I approached, my stomach dropped. The tires, all 4 of them, were unmistakably slashed, jagged cuts rendering them useless. A cold dread trickled down my spine. This wasn't some random accident or an unfortunate encounter with sharp rocks. Someone had done this deliberately, maliciously. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively scanned the forest's edge, searching for movement, for a glimpse of whoever might still be lurking. Nothing. Only the soft patter of rain on the leaves and the occasional creak of branches swayed by the wind. The forest, once alive with its own secret rhythms, now felt oppressive. The very air seemed heavier, as though it conspired to keep me there. Panic crept in, its icy fingers tightening around my chest. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. My mind raced through possibilities. Was someone watching me now, hidden among the trees? Every rustle of leaves felt like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to shift and stretch, reaching toward me. I was alone, or at least I hoped I was. I stood there, frozen, the weight of my predicament pressing down on me like the darkened clouds above. With no cell service, calling for help was out of the question. The narrow, winding road leading back to civilization stretched for miles, an exhausting journey that would leave me exposed and vulnerable to whatever was out there. My options were grim, but climbing higher for signal seemed like the least reckless choice. Reluctantly, I turned back toward the trail, every step heavier with unease, and began my ascent. The forest, once serene, now felt oppressive, each shadow a potential threat. The rain intensified, dripping from the leaves and amplifying the eerie silence between gusts of wind. The path became slick and treacherous, forcing me to watch my footing. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, but the sensation grew stronger with every step. Halfway to the summit, the faint rustling began. It was almost imperceptible, blending with the natural sounds of the forest, but it was there, somewhere behind me. I stopped abruptly, holding my breath. The sound ceased. The only thing I could hear was the rain dripping onto the saturated ground. Slowly, I resumed hiking, and as I moved, so did the noise. It was faint, like dry leaves brushing against each other, but unmistakably synchronized with my steps. My chest tightened. Someone, or something, was following me. I quickened my pace, each step more deliberate than the last. My heart pounded as adrenaline surged through my veins, urging me to move faster. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering like silent witnesses to whatever was unfolding. Shadows grew darker as the dim light of dusk faded, and the rain added an almost cinematic quality to the tension, like a background score building to a crescendo. Every few minutes I glanced back, careful not to make it obvious. Each time the forest appeared still, but the uneasy sensation of being watched never left me. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it an animal? A person? If so, why wouldn't they just reveal themselves? The lack of answers only heightened my fear. As I neared the summit, the rustling stopped entirely. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the noise. I reached the peak, and to my immense relief, my phone flickered to life with a faint signal. Shaking, I dialed 911, stammering my situation into the receiver. The slashed tires, the feeling of being followed, and my isolation deep in the forest. The dispatcher's calm, steady voice reassured me that help was on the way. Knowing someone was now aware of my location provided a flicker of comfort, but I wasn't safe yet. I hung up and looked around. The summit offered a breathtaking view that I barely registered, my attention fixed on the darkening trail I'd just climbed. The thought of descending through the woods in near darkness, with whatever or whoever was out there, made my stomach churn. But I had no choice. Every instinct screamed that heading back to my car would be more perilous than the ascent. The dispatcher had promised help was coming, and I needed to be there to meet them. Summoning what courage I had left, I took a shaky breath and began planning my descent. The forest below was now a labyrinth of shadows, each one potentially hiding danger. The rain, though light, distorted sounds and blurred my vision, adding to the disorienting atmosphere. My footsteps felt too loud, echoing in the oppressive quiet. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard the faintest crunch of leaves again. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. I just kept moving, forcing my legs to carry me forward despite the growing weight of dread. As night crept closer, I knew one thing for certain. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a presence, and it was watching me. I decided to take an indirect route, hoping to throw off whoever might be tracking me. Using my phone's map, I planned a semicircular path down the mountain. For a while, it worked. I didn't hear a single suspicious sound, but then a twig snapped to my left. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Moments later, another sound came from behind me. My heart sank as I realized I wasn't dealing with just one person. Fear gave way to adrenaline. I started jogging, but my panic spiked when I stumbled across a hidden campsite. There was a circle of logs around a burned-out fire pit, evidence that someone had been there recently. I hurried past, glancing nervously over my shoulder. Not long after, I caught a glimpse of a foot disappearing behind a tree. That was the final straw. I broke into a sprint, no longer caring about the noise I was making. The forest suddenly seemed alive, as though every shadow held a secret, every rustle masked a threat. At first I heard the sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Then they multiplied, becoming a cacophony of deliberate, hurried movements. Panic gripped me as the realization dawned. I wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever was out there, wasn't trying to hide anymore. They were chasing me. My breath quickened as I forced my exhausted legs to move faster, the forest blurring around me in a haze of fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing through the damp air. Stealing a glance behind me, I froze in terror. At least half a dozen figures emerged from the shadows, their white clothing stark against the dark forest backdrop. They moved with unsettling coordination, their pace relentless, as though they were fueled by some purpose I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled over roots and slick patches of mud, the rain-slicked ground conspiring against me. My lungs burned, and exhaustion clawed at my resolve, but the fear of capture kept me going. I couldn't let myself imagine what they wanted or why they were after me. It was the only way to keep moving forward. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trail an unforgiving labyrinth. My focus narrowed to the rhythmic pounding of my feet and the relentless pursuit behind me. The rain, once a nuisance, now felt like a cruel accomplice, its constant patter masking the precise location of my pursuers. My mind raced, teetering on the edge of panic as I tried to strategize and escape. But there was no time, no room for plans, only survival. Finally, like a beacon in the suffocating darkness, my car came into view. Relief surged through me, but it was fleeting. Parked beside my car was a police cruiser, its lights a dull reassurance in the gloom. I stumbled forward, my legs barely supporting me as adrenaline began to wane. The officer stepped out just as I reached him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I collapsed against his vehicle, trembling with exhaustion and fear. My words were a jumbled mess as I tried to explain what had happened, gesturing wildly toward the forest. When I finally managed to turn back, the group that had been chasing me was gone. Not a single figure remained. The forest once again eerily still, as though it had swallowed them whole. The officer looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief, but didn't hesitate to act. He told me he had already called for roadside assistance, which was a small relief amid the chaos. But his next words made the hairs on my neck stand on end. He explained that this particular forest was notorious for its unsettling history, attracting strange groups and secretive communities. He speculated that I might have inadvertently stumbled upon the territory of one such group, perhaps a cult or an isolated faction of individuals who guarded their privacy with zeal. The campsite I'd passed earlier flashed through my mind, its crude circle of logs and recent signs of habitation suddenly taking on a far more sinister significance. The officer's voice hardened as he scolded me for venturing into such an isolated area alone, especially without notifying anyone of my plans. He called it reckless, and though I wanted to protest, I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. I had been so consumed by the idea of escaping my own thoughts on this solitary hike that I had ignored the dangers lurking in the unknown. Even now, years later, the memory still haunts me. I can't help but wonder why they chose to stalk and chase me rather than confront me outright. What was their intention? Was it a warning, or was I closer to danger than I could comprehend? These questions remain unanswered, and while I still love hiking, I doubt I'll ever feel entirely safe doing it alone again. That forest, with its secrets and shadows, has left a mark on me that no amount of distance or time. I wouldn't go so far as to label myself a professional hiker, but hiking has been one of my greatest passions for as long as I can remember. Over the years, this love for the outdoors has taken me on countless adventures, each offering its own set of challenges and rewards. From winding trails through dense woodlands to precarious mountain climbs that tested my limits, I've been fortunate to experience some of the most breathtaking landscapes this country has to offer. My journey has spanned decades, during which I've explored nearly all the renowned hiking trails across the United States. These trails have taken me through national parks that showcase America's diverse beauty, from arid deserts and lush rainforests to snow-capped peaks and sprawling plains. So far, I've visited about 75% of the national parks, each trip leaving me with unforgettable memories and an ever-growing appreciation for the wilderness. However, as time passed, I began to crave something different, something that would reignite the excitement I felt as a novice hiker. While popular trails and well-mapped parks were undeniably stunning, they no longer carried the same sense of unpredictability and discovery I once sought. So, I started looking for ways to bring back that element of mystery to my adventures. This led to a rather unconventional new hobby, spending hours scouring Google Maps in search of remote, unmarked forests and lesser-known wilderness areas. Once I found a promising spot, I'd plan a trip to explore it. There's a certain allure to stepping into the unknown, where there are no marked paths or guideposts to rely on. While the idea of wandering into such untouched places might seem risky or even reckless to some, I relished the challenge. The thrill of uncovering something new far outweighed the potential downside of getting temporarily disoriented, or so I believed at the time. Of course, even I recognized the importance of some level of precaution, especially when venturing into uncharted territory. To guard against the risk of losing my way, I devised a simple yet effective system. I carry with me a set of homemade stickers, brightly colored and adhesive enough to stay put on tree bark. As I hike, I carefully place these markers along my route, ensuring I can follow them back to my starting point. On the return trip, I peel off each sticker, leaving the forest as untouched as I found it. It's a straightforward method, but it's proven invaluable. In all my years of hiking, I've rarely been lost for more than a few minutes. I'm genuinely surprised more outdoor enthusiasts haven't adopted a similar practice. It's like a breadcrumb trail, but environmentally friendly and reliable. For my latest adventure, I decided to push the envelope further and explore a location that would test my resolve: Black Hollow Forest in Vermont. This wasn't your average stretch of wilderness. The forest sits on the site of a long-abandoned settlement, one that dates back to the 1800s. Over time, the area has gained a reputation steeped in eerie tales and chilling legends. Stories of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena have surrounded Black Hollow for decades, making it a place of both fascination and fear for those who know of it. If you're a fan of spooky history, I'd highly recommend researching it. It's the kind of place that could inspire an entire collection of ghost stories. As for me, I've never been one to let superstitions or folklore dictate my actions. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of the other supernatural elements that often fuel such tales. For me, the legends surrounding Black Hollow were just another layer of intrigue, not a deterrent. What did give me pause, however, was the fact that the forest is technically off-limits to visitors. Still, I've never been one to let a minor detail like that stop me from pursuing an adventure. The idea of having an entire forest to myself, free from the noise of other hikers, was too enticing to resist. Being based in New England, the drive to Vermont was manageable, and I eagerly set off one sunny morning, my anticipation building with every mile. I arrived at the forest around midday, timing my entry to ensure I'd have plenty of daylight to complete my hike. As I stepped into the woods, I was immediately struck by an unusual sensation. I had read accounts of the eerie silence that enveloped Black Hollow, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. It's hard to describe just how disconcerting it feels to stand in a forest devoid of sound. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of wildlife. Nothing. The absence of these familiar noises created a vacuum, amplifying the sound of my own breathing and footsteps to an almost oppressive degree. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine sitting alone in a soundproof room where the only noise is the rhythmic rise and fall of your breath. Now, picture that same quiet stretching out endlessly around you, with no walls or boundaries to contain it. That's what it felt like to stand in Black Hollow. It was as though the forest itself had been paused, frozen in a moment of unnatural stillness. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I pressed on, my curiosity outweighing my discomfort. I reminded myself that I'd been in quiet forests before, and this one was no different, or so I hoped. Though the unsettling stillness of the forest gnawed at my nerves, I tried to reassure myself. I'd encountered lifeless woods before, ones so devoid of wildlife, they felt more like static paintings than living ecosystems. This, I told myself, was no different. So I pressed on, placing my stickers as I went, each one a small beacon of familiarity in an otherwise alien environment. Yet the lack of any signs of life, no chirping birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects, grew increasingly unnatural with every step. My footsteps, muffled by the soft earth, seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence, as if the forest itself was amplifying them. At one point I caught myself hoping to stumble upon another person. That thought alone was strange for me. After all, solitude was the very reason I ventured into these remote places. But in that moment, I yearned for any confirmation that I wasn't completely alone in this silent expanse. As I walked, I did eventually start to relax. The silence, though eerie, began to feel less like a threat and more like a peculiar quirk of this place. My breathing slowed, and my grip on the strap of my backpack loosened. Maybe the stories about this forest were just that. Stories. Nothing more. The calm, however, didn't last. Just as I began to feel at ease, a sound broke through the stillness. It wasn't a snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It was a low, mournful wail, rising and falling like a sorrowful melody carried by some unseen force. I froze mid-step, every muscle in my body tensing as the noise continued. The sound wasn't constant. It ebbed and flowed like a wounded animal trying to cry out but struggling to sustain its voice. Even now I struggled to describe it. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, something that defied easy explanation. What made it worse was its context. This sound, so raw and unnatural, was the only sound in the entire forest. In a place as silent as this, the noise felt like an intrusion, a crack in the unnatural stillness. I stood there, straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. My eyes darted through the trees, searching for any movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless trunks and shadows of the forest. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it the wind? No, there wasn't the faintest breeze to stir the air. Was it an animal? Possibly. though the tone of the sound made me doubt it. It didn't feel alive. Deciding it was best not to linger, I started moving again, this time in the opposite direction of the sound. The wail faded into the distance as I increased my pace, though it still echoed in my mind. If you're wondering why I didn't immediately turn back and leave, trust me, I've asked myself that same question countless times since. In the moment, I rationalized it. One strange noise doesn't mean anything, I told myself. If it happens again, then I'll leave. That decision would haunt me. I hadn't gone much farther when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. On the tree directly ahead of me were carvings, jagged and erratic, etched deeply into the bark. They weren't letters, nor were they anything resembling an animal's claw marks. They looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. My stomach turned as I scanned the area and realized these carvings weren't isolated. Several nearby trees bore similar marks, each one more unsettling than the last. That was it. My curiosity was officially overpowered by my sense of self-preservation. I spun around and began retracing my steps, carefully peeling off my stickers as I went. The bright markers I'd placed earlier were a small comfort, each one a reminder that I could still find my way back. But as I moved, something felt wrong. Up ahead, where the forest began to thin slightly, I saw something new. A cave. Or maybe it was a den, looming in the distance. Its dark entrance gaped like an unblinking eye, and it immediately struck me that this was something I should have noticed on my way in. There was no way I could have missed it earlier. Then the realization hit me, sending a cold wave of dread down my spine. My trail markers, the ones I'd carefully placed at shoulder height, were now at waist level. Someone or something had moved them, and my breath caught in my throat as the implications sank in. Someone had been following me, close enough to alter my markers without me noticing. Worse, they'd shifted the trail to lead me straight toward that cave. My legs locked in place as I stared at the markers ahead, trying to comprehend what kind of person or creature would do this. I didn't wait to find out. Without a second thought, I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. The forest, once eerily silent, now seemed to echo with the sound of my panicked steps. My heart sank. Someone, or something, had been following me, tampering with my markers, likely to guide me toward that cave. Panic set in, and I sprinted away, checking over my shoulder. Without the markers to guide me, I had no idea where I was going. Desperate, I pulled out my phone. Miraculously, I had 1 bar of service and was able to check the location of my car, but as soon as I figured out the direction, the signal vanished. Just as I started running again, the wailing resumed, louder and closer this time. It felt as though it was right behind me, yet every time I looked, there was nothing there. I ran harder than I ever had before, driven by pure adrenaline. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the forest. The moment I stepped out, the wailing stopped. I dove into my car and sped off, leaving the nightmare behind. To this day, I've avoided hiking. My rational explanation is that some hermit or forest dweller noticed me, moved my markers, and tried to lure me to the cave. Maybe they had a device to make that eerie noise, which stopped once they realized they wouldn't catch me. But even this theory has its holes. For instance, how could someone keep producing that sound while keeping up with me? If you have a better explanation, I'd love to hear it. Maybe there's a reason that forest is off limits. When I was growing up, my childhood home was the ultimate hangout spot for my group of friends. There were several reasons for this. My dad had an enormous rec room in the basement, stocked with what felt like an endless supply of beer. My parents didn't seem to mind if we drank down there as long as we stayed out of trouble, and they usually left us to ourselves. Our house sat on a sprawling property bordered by a dense forest, and if you walked through those woods, you'd come out onto a dirt road. Over the years, I had made countless trips to the reservoir property, sneaking in through the woods or cutting through the fences that lined its perimeter. Trespassing on the property was, without question, illegal. It was clearly marked with no trespassing signs and warnings about hefty fines. But to me, those warnings didn't matter. I was a kid and the reservoir was my secret haven. It was more than just a spot to break the rules. It was a place where the noise of the world fell away, replaced by the soft rustle of trees and the gentle lapping of water. I'd sneak out there to do just about anything, to swim on hot summer days, to let my thoughts drift freely. It was a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, away from the prying eyes of my parents and the pressures of school. Its serene beauty felt timeless, a hidden gem that belonged solely to those brave or foolish enough to venture into forbidden territory. Even now, as I reflect on that time in my life, the reservoir stands out as one of the few things I genuinely miss about my youth. One particular evening, my friends and I were hanging out in my basement, the usual spot for our group's meetups. We were casually playing pool, creating a chaotic yet familiar backdrop. As the game dragged on and the boredom began to creep in, my buddy Alex suddenly had an idea. "Why don't we head to the reservoir?" he asked, his face lighting up with excitement. The sun was still up, and the idea of getting outside felt like a welcome change from the stuffy basement. That night, there were 5 of us: me, Alex, Liam, Jonah, and Tariq. We'd been close friends for years, and this kind of spontaneous plan was nothing new. Before we headed out, Liam and Tariq, the 2 notorious drinkers of our group, grabbed a few beers to take along. I'd already had my fair share earlier in the evening, so I decided to sit this one out. There was no point in overdoing it. As we stepped into the woods, the lingering dampness from an earlier rainstorm clung to the air, making the ground soft and muddy beneath our feet. Despite the slippery conditions, we pressed on, laughing and joking as we made our way through the familiar terrain. Reaching the reservoir meant crossing the worn-down fence, a ritual we'd done so many times that it felt like second nature. On the near side of the reservoir was a cliff that had become our usual gathering spot, offering a stunning view of the water below. The spot felt secluded and safe, like our own private hideout, and we spent a while there, chatting and enjoying the peaceful ambience. Eventually, though, the cliff lost its appeal, and someone suggested we explore further. We decided to venture to the far side of the reservoir, a place we didn't visit as often. To get there, we had to walk the length of the near side, cross over at the far end, and then follow the shoreline until we reached a smooth, sandy area we called the beach. The trek was long, and the muddy trails made it even more challenging, but the picturesque scenery made every step worth it. The reflection of the setting sun on the water, combined with the dense forest surrounding us, created an almost magical atmosphere. It felt like an adventure, one of those moments that stick with you long after they've passed. We were about halfway along the far side when Tariq suddenly stopped and pointed into the distance. Something was moving along the reservoir's edge, on the same side as us, but much farther down. Intrigued, we hushed and watched as a dark figure slowly emerged from the woods, dragging something behind them. As they got closer to the water, we realized they were pulling a large black garbage bag, one that was clearly heavy, judging by how slowly they moved. The 5 of us exchanged uneasy glances. We had heard rumors about bodies being found in the reservoir before, and our minds immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. The figure knelt by the water, their movements deliberate, but we couldn't see exactly what they were doing. We decided it was time to leave while they were distracted. Just as we were about to head back, Alex spotted more movement. 3 additional figures stepped out of the woods, 2 of them dragging similar bags, while the 3rd carried a kayak. I felt a chill run down my spine. The first person got into the kayak, and the others helped load one of the bags onto it. We watched in horror as they paddled out to the middle of the reservoir and dropped the bag into the water. This process repeated with the other 2 bags. Then my phone rang, shattering the silence. The men froze, their heads snapping in our direction. Panic consumed us as we bolted through the dense forest, each step a desperate attempt to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. The woods, usually so familiar and inviting, had transformed into a treacherous maze under the veil of night. Roots and branches seemed to reach out like claws, tripping and snagging our feet, making every movement a struggle. The air was thick with fear, each ragged breath a reminder of the danger closing in behind us. What were those men capable of? The thought alone made my legs burn with a renewed urgency. As we neared the fence, our only barrier to safety, my chest tightened. The hole we'd cut to get in was nowhere in sight. In the chaos of our escape, I had lost my bearings entirely. My friends huddled close, their panic palpable, voices rising in fear as we fumbled along the fence line. Tariq kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering that he could hear footsteps growing louder behind us. Just as I was about to give up and prepare for the worst, Liam's voice cut through the chaos like a lifeline. "There it is!" he shouted, pointing to a barely visible opening just ahead. We surged forward, scrambling through the gap, the sharp edges of the torn fence scraping against our clothes and skin. As I helped Tariq through, a sudden snap of a branch shattered the tense silence. It was close. Too close. My head whipped around, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but I didn't wait to find out. Adrenaline overpowered every rational thought, and we ran as if our lives depended on it, our only focus now on the dim glow of my backyard lights in the distance. When we finally burst into the yard, the relief was fleeting. Tariq, trembling, fumbled with his phone and called the police. His voice cracked as he tried to explain what had happened, the words spilling out in a rush. For a brief moment, I worried about the trouble we'd get into for trespassing, but that thought evaporated as soon as I looked at my friends' faces. Fear had stripped away everything else. We just wanted to be safe. The police arrived in record time, their lights casting eerie patterns across the trees as they combed the area. We stayed huddled together, recounting the events of the night to a skeptical officer. When they asked if we were sure no one else had followed us into the backyard, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Check the fence," I insisted. "Those footprints aren't ours." Sure enough, the officers found a fresh set of muddy prints leading right up to the fence but stopping short, as if whoever left them had been watching us before disappearing into the night. A few days later, the news confirmed our worst fears. The police had pulled not one, but 3 bodies from the reservoir. The victims were never identified publicly, and no arrests were ever made, leaving the story shrouded in mystery. The discovery dominated local headlines for weeks, but for my friends and me, it wasn't just a sensational news story. It was a nightmare that refused to end. My mum, already on edge, became convinced that someone was still watching us. She swore she saw silhouettes moving through the woods at night, their dark shapes lingering just beyond the tree line. Once, she even claimed she saw the unmistakable flash of a camera, as if someone were documenting our home. At first we thought she was imagining things, but the unease was infectious. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle of leaves outside made my stomach drop. One night, about a month after the incident, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside my window. I froze, straining to hear. My heart pounded as I peered through the blinds, but all I saw was darkness. The next morning I found faint tracks in the dirt beneath the window, leading back toward the woods. That was the final straw for my family. Within weeks, we had packed up and moved away, leaving behind the house and the memories of that terrifying night. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the reservoir holds more secrets than anyone could ever uncover. Recently, I stumbled upon an article about a teenager who had drowned there, sparking a flood of memories. The details were chillingly familiar, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was truly an accident or if the curse of that place had claimed another victim. As I read, I thought back to the figures we saw that night, the garbage bags and the kayak. What were they hiding? Who were they? Those questions still haunt me, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the dark waters of the reservoir rippling in the moonlight, hiding whatever horrors lie beneath.